Just a content warning: racism, sexism, queerphobia, particularly transphobia, ableism with mentions of slavery and rape. As above, so below. With so many things, when a small group of people who have otherwise been marginalized gain some grounds, there is always a backlash that far exceeds the crime of progress gained by said group. Any step taken towards representation or agency is, at best, treated as a vicious crime against the norm, and at worst, a further degeneration away from the mythological golden era that fascists so love to point to. It was 2012 when actress Samantha Stenberg, who was only 12 years old at the time, was brutally harassed for appearing as the character Rue in the first Hunger Games film. A massive racist campaign of hatred directed at a child whose only crime was being a black girl playing a black girl. This was a year before the Black Lives Matter movement took off. The harassment campaign known as Gamergate was already 2 years old when the hate campaign was launched against Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear, for the crime of merely having a transgender character, Mizena, which was framed as shoehorning of social justice issues into the game. I can give 1,000 examples of this behavior. Marginalized actors, marginalized characters cannot exist without being called political. Merely existing is, in and of itself, a crime worth harassing children, creative teams, even fans who do so little as show a like for the art in question. At this point, I have to mention that I do speak of things like PC, console games, even sports under the larger aegis of art or media, in this video and in other places. If this bothers you, cope. The thing is that, historically speaking, marginalized people, whether in society or in art, face incredible backlash merely for existing. The scrutiny faced by marginalized people is outsized and never matches the scrutiny endured by, say, white cisgender heterosexual men in the arts. No matter how average, below average, or even bad said white cisgender heterosexual men in the arts happen to be, the hatred, vitriol, anger, and violence is unmatched. And of course, the modern sensibility surrounding marginalized people means that people performing their hatred of marginalized people cannot merely come out and say it. Innuendo Studios did do a fantastic video called The Death of Euphemism that unpacks societal backsliding in regards to how bigots speak about marginalized people. Go watch Innuendo Studios' whole playlist called The Alt-Right Playbook. It's fantastic. But for the sake of this video, let's pretend that modern society does at least have a very small amount of shame when it comes to bigotry. It does and it doesn't, but that's a different conversation. As a consequence, a lot of these violent harassment campaigns simply cannot state, "I hate women," or "seeing black people on screen makes me irrationally angry." They have to cloak a lot of their language in euphemism and dog whistles. The harassment campaign that was known as Gamergate started because of a hate campaign by a creep in August of 2014 against his former girlfriend, the game developer Zoe Quinn. He made a number of false accusations against Quinn regarding her game Depression Quest, which resulted in Quinn receiving harassment, death threats, rape threats, being doxxed. I'm not going to give you the full history of Gamergate here, but this harassment and violence spilled out against many other women in the gaming sphere, and of course the hate and harassment off the bat gave Gamergate a very negative image in the media and specifically in social media. The online abusers, trolls, doxers, etc. began claiming that the harassment campaign wasn't about harassment and threats and violence, but instead about ethics in video game journalism. The very phrase ethics in video game journalism became a shorthand for "I'm being a violent, bigoted asshole, but I'm going to try my very best to convince you otherwise by the use of some linguistic legerdemain." Ultimately, the abuse and hatred and bigotry was entirely too evident for the world at large, and I like to believe that people look back at Gamergate as the violent, misogynistic movement it was. But Gamergate aside, I am interested in looking at the little bit of legerdemain that was ethics in video game journalism. It was a small lie, but an effective one. "We're not violent, you see," they say. "We have legitimate concerns, you see," they say. Rue wasn't really black in Hunger Games. Our racist backlash was justified, they say. Xena is an unnecessary shoehorning in of a transgender character. We're not transphobic. She's just a bad character. And besides, we don't want to hear about transgender characters. That's shoehorning in issues that don't belong here, they say. It's political, they say. Political has become a strange shorthand for any actor or character that isn't straight, white, cisgender, and male. The original spirit of Dungeons & Dragons, females and wheelchairs. D&D has never been particularly free from this nonsense. Gary Gygax, the foremost creator of D&D, was well known for his sexism and misogyny. He said as much. In Europa 1975, he explicitly says, "I have been accused of being a nasty old sexist male chauvinist pig, for the wording in D&D isn't what it should be. There should be more emphasis on the female role, more non-gendered names, and so forth. I thought perhaps these folks were right and considered adding woman in the raping and pillaging section, in the whores and tavern wenches chapter, the special magical part dealing with hags and crones, and thought perhaps of adding an appendix on medieval harems, slave girls, and going Viking. Damn right, I am sexist. It doesn't matter to me if women get paid as much as men, get jobs traditionally male, and shower in the men's locker room. They can jolly well stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. I've seen many a good war game, and wargamers spoiled thanks to the fairer sex." And you can spin this bullshit as hard as you like, but this is sexism. This is misogyny. Racism is baked into D&D lore. Light elves are bi-essentially good, and dark elves, drow, are bi-essentially evil. Light dwarves are bi-essentially good, and dark dwarves, duergar, are bi-essentially evil. Gnomes versus deep gnomes, you get the idea. Obviously the outliers exist, I love Drizzt, but they serve to highlight this duality. When Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out in 2020, there were again huge grumblings about D&D stepping back from the bioessentialist morality of its races, and the man-children yet again threw their toys out of the cot. It was a repeating pattern of D&D has a gross element, D&D has a gross element addressed or fixed, D&D includes more inclusive roles, grognards come out of the woodwork to complain, aluta continua. Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel came out in 2022, and the racists came out in droves to complain about how a book written by people of color for people of color was somehow again shoehorning black people into spaces where they don't belong. Oh sorry, no, they said it was being political. Blah blah ethics in video game journalism. Basically, there has never been a so-called golden age of D&D. D&D has always had its problems. White cishet boys excluding or creeping on girls in the hobby has always been a problem. The exclusion of black and queer people in the hobby has always been a problem. If anything, the original spirit of D&D is this, a bunch of privileged white boys who have had their preconceptions and prejudices against other people reinforced in a fantasy setting, and everyone else having to put up with their bigotry, violence, or creepiness, or alternatively having to handhold them into reality and adulthood. This is the original spirit of D&D. There is a large community of these boys who grew into man-children who still hold on to these ideas into adulthood. Any challenge to their precious darlings is met with the exact childish reactionary cries and grumblings and mythologization of "back in my day I walked a D&D in 5 feet of snow uphill both ways." It's nonsense, it's childish, and it's unnecessary. The Golden Age is a myth. In his 2022 book, Fascist Mythologies, Federico Finkelstein writes, "For fascism, myth was reality, or was realer than the real. Fascist notions of the leader, the nation, power, and violence were steeped in mythic imagery and the fantasy of transcending history. A mythologized primordial past would inspire the heroic overthrow of a debased present to achieve a violently redeemed future. The mythological past remembered by the reactionary man-child fighting against progress never existed. Now, to be fair, not every person who likes old school is a fascist, and there are people who genuinely enjoy old school D&D for the sake of enjoying old school D&D. Overwhelmingly, though, the old school reactionaries, the so-called grognards, by far take up all the oxygen in the room when it comes to talk about wargaming or AD&D. And of course, nothing pisses on the batteries of the Golden Age mythmakers more than when people come out of the woodwork talking about how bad Gary Gygax's sexism was. My examples have not been exhaustive. Any person who writes about history of D&D honestly have been met with the same levels of vitriol, threats, and abuse as before. Aside, I'd argue, if anything, the true golden age of D&D, especially from a financial perspective, happened during the 5e explosion that took place in large part due to Critical Role and Dimension 20, which saw the increase of players interested in story-driven games, or mixed-tier games, or, gods forbid, just players who want to mess around but aside over. People are exhausted by the old god grumbling about back in my day, and some of these grumblers are younger than me. Back in your day when you were in diapers, I was 13 being kicked out of my house for owning polyhedral dice because they're satanic. I lived through satanic panic, a real moral panic. This pseudo-moral war the conservatives and grognards and bigots are waging is entirely artificial. They are not the victims. Nobody took anything from them. The inclusion of queer people and women and people of color and disabled people did less than zero to them. People actually making fun of the old god's bullshit strikes a very delicate nerve, apparently. Disrespect, they cry. I'm reminded of Autistic Abby's Tumblr post that reads, "Sometimes people use respect to mean treating someone like a person, and sometimes they use respect to mean treating someone like an authority. And sometimes people who are used to being treated like an authority say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you. And they mean, if you won't treat me like an authority, I won't treat you like a person. And they think that they're being fair, but they aren't. And it's not okay." A quote which I feel typifies the way privileged people in D&D spaces treat marginalized people. You cannot demand respect from people you've politicized, othered, and gatekept. The emerald elephant in the room. I am not going to talk about Elon Musk. I don't care. Let him buy D&D, let him not buy D&D. Wizards of the Coast owns D&D and I loathe them about as much as I do Elon Musk. Both take up too much space in this conversation as it is. People appealing to Musk to buy D&D to save it are like people asking an arsonist to buy a house to stop it from burning down. Also, Musk can't save D&D in the same way WotC can't save D&D, in the same way that the grognards can't save D&D. Pandora's box is open. The circumstantial barriers to escapism. An interesting overreaction among the bigots, conservatives, and grognards, Venn diagram that however you wish, was when the wheelchair was introduced to D&D. It was 2019 and Sarah Thompson just posted about her concept of introducing a wheelchair into D&D and the internet exploded. Escapism, immersion, and suspension of disbelief were all concepts thrown around as if we weren't all playing a game about fucking dragons, and in some cases fucking dragons. How am I supposed to play a wizard with the powers of a god if someone exists in this world that makes me a little bit sad? I'm not going to beat around the bush, it's pathetic. This excuse of escapism was widely used throughout the various bigotries, covering everything from ableism, racism, queerphobia. The barriers to escapism are always so fascinatingly variable. While magic and manticores are somehow acceptable things to suspend your belief over, a queer person somehow robs you of that little pleasure. The fact that D&D never really solved how centaurs would handle ladders is something utterly ignored by even the most devout grognard. But a person in a wheelchair is suddenly too much to lend credence to. A dragon hoarding a village's wealth is meaningless fantasy devoid of any meaning or deeper interpretation. I am being sarcastic, but the existence of queer stories and black stories and women who are more than rape fantasies, no Jesus, that is political. Engaging in art and life as an adult. I've seen a meme floating around in various iterations that basically reads, "Conservatives will always speak of a more simple time, but the times weren't more simple. The conservatives were just kids. They were sheltered. They grew up. They learned that life is complicated, and they think that times are less simple as a result." I am paraphrasing. If you know where this quote comes from, please leave a comment. I'd love to know where it comes from. But the same can be said of D&D. We're never going to be 12 again. We're never going to be able to engage with D&D or any art or life at large as innocence again. We know too much. We've learned too much. Some of us can pretend we don't. Some of us can vociferously insist we don't know better. Anti-intellectualism and fascism go hand in hand. But you cannot unknow something just because it makes you uncomfortable. Believe me, the vast majority of marginalized people wish they had the luxury of existing beyond certain realities. But being a grown-up means that your darlings were never as pure as you thought they were. Your golden age of D&D never existed. The original spirit of D&D is going extinct. And sometimes politics in D&D is just other human beings and their stories being told. We can't go back. There's nothing to go back to. The fight for a pure or apolitical D&D is always a fight for D&D free of politicized peoples, and the grieving bigots have already lost. The only thing they're fighting is their own temper tantrum that the wrong kind of people are at the table now, and maybe their outdated views about the world aren't going to go unchallenged anymore. In closing, the thing is that there is nothing inherently political about queer people, women, people of color, wheelchairs, etc. in D&D. These are morally neutral things. A story entirely composed of these things aren't shoehorning anything in anywhere. It's not an SJW conspiracy, it's not woke, and any person who tells you otherwise is a creep, a con artist, or both. I don't have a neat bow for you to wrap things up with. I would like to thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good 2025. Remember that you are not alone. Please take care of each other, folks. Mwah.